Good day, everyone. Let us now deal with critical legal studies. Critical legal studies, or CLS, began in the 1970s within American law schools as a radical intellectual movement. It arose from dissatisfaction with mainstream legal thought, particularly the liberal legalist tradition that presented law as neutral, objective, and apolitical. The scholars who formed CLS were influenced by American legal realism of the 1920s and 1930s, which had already exposed how judicial decision making was influenced by personal and political factors rather than by mechanical application of rules. Yet, CLS went further, incorporating ideas from Marxist theory, post structuralism, and critical theory. It argued that law is not a fixed body of rules to be neutrally applied. Instead, it is a deeply political and ideological practice that maintains structures of power and privilege. Far from being impartial, law serves as an instrument that both reflects and reinforces inequalities tied to a class, race, and gender. Critical legal studies did not spring forth ex nihilo, out of nothing. Its intellectual ancestry lies in American legal realism of early 20th century. Realists like Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Carl Llewellyn, and Jerome Frank were among the first to shake legal formalism at its core, insisting that law is not a self-contained logical system but a product of social realities and judicial discretion. CLS inherited this skepticism but went further. While realism described the gap between rules and practice, CLS insisted that this gap was systematically filled by politics, ideology, and power. Thus, CLS can be understood as both a continuation and a radicalization of realism, building on its critics but moving toward an explicitly political transformative project. American legal realism confronted the prevailing belief in legal formalism, the idea that judges merely applied rules to facts like machines. Oliver Wendell Holmes, in his work The Common Law, published in 1881, famously declared that law's life is not logic but experience, an early articulation of law as socially rooted. Carl Llewellyn emphasized the need to study what courts actually do, coining the idea of a law in action distinct from law in the books. Jerome Frank, in his work Law and the Modern Mind, published in 1930, highlighted judicial subjectivity, quipping that what the judge had for breakfast may determine the outcome. Collectively, the realists insisted that law was indeterminate in many cases, and outcomes reflected judicial psychology, values, and broader social influences, not abstract syllogistic deduction. Legal realism advanced several enduring insights. First, indeterminacy. Many legal rules are vague, contradictory, or open to multiple interpretations. Second, law should be understood in predictive terms, as what judges are likely to do in fact, rather than what statutes say. Third, judicial behavior is contextual, influenced by social, economic, and psychological factors. Finally, realists urge an empirical approach, studying how law actually functions in practice from trial courts to administrative agencies rather than treating doctrine as self-explanatory. These insights destabilized legal formalism and opened the door for more radical critiques. Critical legal studies built directly on realist critique. Like realism, CLS emphasizes the indeterminacy of legal reasoning and the social embeddedness of judicial decision. Yet, CLS pushes further. Whereas realism often stopped at the description, law is uncertain, judges rely on context, CLS asks, Why this uncertainty consistently reinforces power structures. According to Alan Hunt, CLS takes the realist critique of formalism and radicalizes it, turning it into a critique of ideology and domination. In this sense, CLS transforms realism's pragmatic skepticism into a politically charged activist project that challenges the very legitimacy of law as an institution of neutral governance. For CLS scholars, indeterminacy is not just a descriptive reality, but an instrument of ideology. The contradictions within law allow judges to cloak political choices in neutral language, legitimating outcomes that preserve existing hierarchies. Thus, law does not merely reflect power, it is a mode of power itself. CLS expanded realism sociological insights with influences from Marxism, law as superstructure, from Gramsci, law as hegemony, and from Foucault, law as power or knowledge. Where realism concluded that judicial behavior was unpredictable, CLS contended that such unpredictability is systematically structured to uphold capitalism, patriarchy, and racial inequality. A fundamental divergence lies in orientation. Realists primarily sought to describe and reform by acknowledging law's indeterminacy. They hoped to make it more honest, empirically grounded, and responsive to society. Carl Llewellyn's program was not revolutionary but pragmatic reform. CLS, however, interprets law as an ideological system that naturalizes injustice, making inequality appear rational, neutral, or inevitable. Thus, CLS's ambition is normative and transformative, seeking not merely to describe how law works, but to challenge its role in reinforcing oppression. As Hunt remarked, realists exposed law's inconsistency, CLS exposed law's complicity in domination. The relationship between realism and CLS can be summarized through both continuities and divergences. Both emphasize indeterminacy and reject the myth of legal formalism. Both see judges as influenced by context rather than abstract rules. Yet, realists treated this as a challenge for reform, while CLS viewed it as an evidence of law's role in sustaining hierarchy. Realists embrace empirical and pragmatic methods, while CLS embrace interdisciplinary critical theory. Realists were reformists, skeptical of formalism, but not of legality itself. CLS was radical, questioning whether law could ever be disentangled from domination. Thus, CLS stands as both an heir and a rebel child of realism. Critical legal studies movement owes much to American legal realism. Realism cracked the facade of legal formalism by showing that law in action diverges from law in the books. CLS tore down the facade entirely, insisting that indeterminacy conceals ideology and law's neutrality is a myth. Where realists sought to describe and reform, CLS sought to critique and transform. This shift from observation to ideology critique is the hallmark of CLS's inheritance and radicalization of realism. Together, they remind us that law is never just logic, it is experience, politics, and above all, power. Critical legal studies that began in 1970s as a dissident movement in American law schools, but its influence far surpasses its institutional presence. At its heart, CLS is a radical critique of law's claims to neutrality, determinacy, and autonomy. The movement questioned whether law could truly be separated from politics or power, insisting instead that law both reflects and reinforces social hierarchies. Though CLS has evolved into many offshoots, such as critical race theory, feminist legal theory, and queer legal studies, its core contributions remain central to critical jurisprudence. Today, we examine four themes that best capture its legacy: legal indeterminacy, law as politics, law as a tool of domination, and the critique of binary opposition in legal thoughts. The first and perhaps most provocative contribution of CLS is the doctrine of legal indeterminacy. CLS scholars argue that legal texts, statutes, precedents, constitutional provisions rarely dictate one single outcome. Instead, they are full of ambiguities, contradictions, and um, competing principles. For example, courts may emphasize freedom of contract in one case, but highlight fairness and equity in another, both justified by precedent. This flexibility reveals that judicial decision-making is not neutral application, but selective reasoning shaped by context, ideology, or preference. As Unger and Schlag remind us, the indeterminacy thesis strikes at the heart of formalism. Law cannot be understood as a closed, objective, and logical system. Instead, it is open-ended, giving judges latitude to construct outcomes that align with broader political and cultural pressure. The second defining contribution is the claim that law is politics. CLS scholars reject the positivist claim that law can be analyzed in isolation from politics. Judicial decisions, legislative interpretations, and administrative rulings are infused with political choices, often reflecting the interests of dominant social groups. For CLS, law is not a separate, self-governing body of norms. It is an arena where political conflicts are fought and resolved under the guise of neutrality. As Duzinas and Perrin of 2011 and Price 1989 emphasized, law is a vehicle through which ideologies are enforced and power relations are stabilized. The significance of this thesis is that it calls into question the legitimacy of legal systems that claim impartiality while operating within political frameworks. Every judicial ruling is, in essence, a political act clothed in legal rhetoric. The third major theme, the third major theme is law's role in domination. CLS argues that while law presents itself as neutral, it often works to preserve existing social hierarchies. Rights discourse, for example, appears empowering, but often functions to limit struggles within narrow, individualized channels. Contract law privileges market logic over social solidarity, while property law stabilizes capitalist relations of ownership. Similarly, criminal law disproportionately impacts marginalized groups, reinforcing racial and class stratification. Scholars like Bartholomew and Hunt in 1990 and McArdle in 2024 highlight how doctrines of rights and neutrality operate as masks, making inequality seem natural, inevitable, and justifiable. However, CLS does not adopt a fatalistic view. It suggests that if radically reimagined, law can also serve as a transformative tool, dismantling oppressive structures rather than reinforcing them. CLS also critiques the binary oppositions that structure legal reasoning. Law often relies on dichotomies like public, private, form, substance, and individual, community. These distinctions appear neutral, but in fact, they are loaded with ideology. For instance, privileging private autonomy over public regulation favors capitalist markets and entrenches inequality. Similarly, treating form as separate from substance allows procedural fairness to be emphasized while substantive injustices persist. Unger in 1996 explains that these false oppositions naturalize a particular worldview, one that elevates individual autonomy over social solidarity, market logic over distributive justice, and elite values over collective needs. By deconstructing these binaries, CLS exposes law's role in privileging certain political choices while obscuring them under a veil of neutrality. The contributions of CLS reach beyond its own network of scholars. By destabilizing the myth of neutrality, determinacy, and apolitical legal reasoning, CLS permanently shifted how jurisprudence is studied. It emphasized that law is not merely technical, but deeply ideological, bound up with systems of class, race, and gender domination. Furthermore, CLS served as the intellectual springboard for critical movements such as critical race theory, feminist legal theory, and queer legal studies. These approaches expanded CLS insights into new domains, addressing the lived experiences of marginalized groups. Even today, CLS provides a methodological lens asking whose interests law serves, whose voices it silences, and how it sustains or challenges injustices. Its greatest legacy lies in reminding us that legal scholarship cannot be divorced from the realities of power, ideology, and politics. If a final and vital contribution of critical legal studies is its critique of the autonomous legal subject, the central figure in liberal legalism. Liberal legal thought assumes that individuals are rational, autonomous, and formally equal before the law. This assumption underpins doctrines in contract law, where parties are presumed to bargain on equal terms, and tort law, where standards of reasonableness are treated as universal. CLS destabilizes this assumption by insisting that identity and agency are socially constructed and constrained. Class, race, gender, and social location profoundly shape one's opportunities, bargaining power, and ability to act. The so-called neutral legal subject is not universal. It is historically modeled on the privileged white, male, propertied subjects of liberal societies. By foregrounding this reality, CLS challenges the adequacy of doctrines that ignore structural inequality and instead presses for a re-examination of law's underlying premises. As Unger in 1984 and Schlag in 1990 observed, this critique is not simply academic. It opens the door for a more context-sensitive and justice-oriented legal order, one responsive to solidarity and real social needs. Although CLS originated in elite U.S. institutions in the 1970s, it did not remain an American phenomenon. Its critique resonated globally, finding fertile ground in different legal traditions. In the United Kingdom, CLS was institutionalized through Critical Legal Conference or CLC, which became a hub for radical debate. The UK's National Critical Lawyers Group also connected activism and scholarship, showing how Marxist and post-structuralist insights could reshape critiques of the common law. On the European continent, CLS gained a distinctly sociological orientation, particularly through Pierre Bourdieu's influential work La Force de Droit of 1986, where he conceptualized law as a form of symbolic capital, a mechanism for reproducing institutional legitimacy, and social hierarchy. Elsewhere, CLS influenced critical approaches to law in Latin America, particularly within dependency theory, and began shaping conversations in Asia and Africa, demonstrating its adaptability across contexts. In the UK, CLS took on distinctive intellectual and activist flavor. The Critical Legal Conference, held annually since the mid-1980s, became a crucial meeting place for scholars and students to debate radical theories of law. Discussions often wrestled with tensions. Should CLS prioritize activism and reform, or theoretical critique and deconstruction? Should it ground itself in continental philosophy or in practical challenges of the common law? The National Critical Lawyers Group further linked radical scholarship with grassroots activism, seeking to democratize access to legal knowledge and foster progressive causes. This UK experience shows that CLS was never monolithic import. It adapted to local traditions, incorporating Marxist, feminist, and post-structuralist perspectives in unique combinations. On the European continent, CLS was enriched by sociological insights. Pierre Bourdieu's seminal work, um, The Force of Law, reframed law as a field where symbolic capital and institutional legitimacy are produced and reproduced. For Bourdieu, law is not merely an ideological tool. It is a practical social force embedded in structures of habitus and power. This perspective expanded CLS beyond doctrinal critique toward a social sociology of legal institutions, showing how courts, universities, and legal professions perpetuate social hierarchies. In this way, European CLS bridged critical theory and empirical social science, underscoring that law cannot be understood apart from its broader institutional and cultural frameworks. CLS also made its mark on legal education. In the United States, Georgetown University Law Center pioneered Curriculum B, a critical alternative to the traditional case method, encouraging students to analyze law in its political, economic, and ideological contexts. In the United Kingdom, universities such as Kent, Birkbeck, and Warwick developed advanced programs in critical legal theory, institutionalizing CLS into the curriculum. This educational innovation disrupted the hierarchy of legal pedagogy, challenging the dominance of case method training that often left structural issues unexamined. Instead, CLS-based education sought to empower students to see law not as a neutral technical craft, but as a site of contestation and potential transformation. CLS also sustained itself through scholarly publishing. Journals such as Law and Critique, founded in the United Kingdom, and the Unbound, Harvard Journal of the Legal Left, provided spaces for radical and experimental legal writing. These journals gave legitimacy to perspectives often marginalized in mainstream law reviews, ensuring the continuity of CLS debates across generations. Such platforms also fostered international collaboration, allowing CLS to spread beyond the US and UK, influencing Latin American, Asian, and African legal scholarship. The persistence of these journals demonstrates that while CLS as a movement may have fragmented, its intellectual life remains vibrant, carried forward by networks of critical scholars worldwide. Critical legal studies profoundly reshaped jurisprudence both in the substance of its critiques and in its global institutional spread. Each challenge to the autonomous legal subject revealed how assumptions of rationality and equality mask structural inequalities. Internationally, CLS adapted to different contexts, philosophical, sociological, and activists, whether through the UK's Critical Legal Conference, Bourdieu's Sociology of Law, or curriculum innovations in United States and UK law schools. Its influence continues through journals, teaching, and critical offshoots like critical race theory and feminist legal theory. CLS endures not as a single movement but as a method of critique, calling legal scholars to confront law's deep entanglement with power and to reimagine law in ways that respond to justice, solidarity, and real human needs. Although the organized CLS network largely disbanded in the 1990s, the ideas and methods of critique it generated remain vibrantly alive. Roberto Unger, 2015, has noted that while CLS as a self-identified movement diminished, its conceptual tools became building blocks for new forms of legal scholarship. CLS reoriented legal theory toward the exposure of power, ideology, and inequality in law. That orientation continues to animate contemporary critical traditions across disciplines, even where scholars no longer identify as critics. In this sense, CLS's influence has moved from being a movement in time to a methodology across generations, a way of questioning the neutrality of law and of uncovering its complicity in broader systems of domination. One of the most influential offshoots of CLS is critical race theory. Building on CLS's critique of neutrality, CRT insists that law is deeply implicated in the construction of race and the maintenance of racial hierarchy. Scholars such as Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw argue that racism is not aberrational but systemic, woven into the very structures of legal institutions. CRT critiques the myth of color blindness, showing how formal equality can mask and perpetuate structural subordination. Grenshaw's concept of intersectionality broadened this critique, revealing how race interacts with gender, class, and other identities to produce layered forms of disadvantage. CLS thus extends, CRT, thus extends CLS's suspicion of neutrality into the domain of racial justice, reshaping debates about constitutional law, civil rights, and social policy. Feminist legal theory also draws heavily from CLS's recognition that law is not neutral. Feminist scholars highlight how doctrines, from family law to labor law, are constructed around male-centered norms. For example, contract law assumes bargaining among equals, yet often ignores women's economic marginalization. Feminist theorists such as Catherine McKinnon advanced a dominance model showing how law reinforces male dominance, particularly in areas like sexual harassment and pornography. Others, like Martha Feynman, emphasized the vulnerability of human dependency, urging a reconceptualization of equality itself. Just as CLS deconstructed law's claims of objectivity, feminist legal theory exposes how patriarchal assumptions shape law's categories, doctrines, and institutions, opening space for more inclusive, transformative understandings. Queer legal theory takes CLS's suspicion of binary reasoning and applies it to sexuality and gender. The law has historically privileged heteronomor- heteronormativity, no? Heteronormativity, embedding assumptions of heterosexual marriage, binary sex categories, and gender conformity into statutes, constitutions, and case law. Queer theorists argue that these frameworks marginalized LGBTQ plus identities and foreclose alternative ways of living. By deconstructing categories like male, female, or natural and natural, queer legal theory follows CLS's method of exposing hidden ideologies in legal reasoning. It also insists on the fluidity of identity and the dangers of law's tendency to fix categories. In this way, queer theory extends CLS into a new terrain, broadening the struggle for recognition and justice. CLS's emphasis on hierarchy and domination has inspired extensions beyond traditional identity categories. Ecofeminism argues that the exploitation of women and the degradation of nature are deeply connected, but rooted in logics of domination and control. This framework critiques how legal systems prioritize industrial and capitalist interests over ecological and human well-being. Meanwhile, post-colonial legal studies interrogates how colonial legacies persist in law, from property regimes imposed on indigenous peoples to trade laws that sustain global inequality. Post-colonial scholars reveal how law continues to structure the North-South divide. They echo CLS's insistence that law is ideological, but they broaden the critique to global structures of imperialism and neo-colonialism. Together, ecofeminism and post-colonial studies show how CLS's methods can be applied to the planetary and international scale. Beyond named offshoots, CLS continues to shape critical scholarship across many domains. In international law, scholars draw on CLS to critique the supposedly neutral principles of sovereignty, showing how they legitimize global inequality. In human rights, CLS perspectives question whether universalist claims mask Western hegemony while still offering tools for resistance. In intellectual property, CLS methodologies reveal how global copyright and patent regimes consolidate corporate dominance at the expense of innovation and access. And in climate justice, critical scholars use CLS to show how law can simultaneously facilitate extractive industries while also providing mechanisms for ecological defense. The breadth of these applications demonstrates CLS's continued adaptability as a toolkit for analyzing power wherever law operates. While CLS as an organized movement faded after the 1990s, its influence remains profound. The frameworks it pioneered, indeterminacy, law as politics, law as ideology, continue to inspire scholars across race, gender, sexuality, environments, and post-colonial studies. Moreover, CLS's critical stance has become a permanent method of inquiry, ensuring that legal reasoning is always scrutinized for the power dynamics it conceals. Whether in constitutional interpretation, global trade law, or environmental regulation, CLS endures as a living intellectual legacy that equips scholars and activists to challenge the status quo and to imagine a law more responsive to justice, solidarity, and human dignity. While critical legal studies radically reshaped jurisprudence, it has not escaped criticisms from across the legal spectrum. Mainstream legal scholars, constitutionalists, and even some sympathetic reformists have raised concerns about CLS's methods and implications. These critiques focus on three central points. its collapse of boundaries between law and politics, its exaggerated thesis of indeterminacy, and its challenge to constitutional democracy's legitimacy. At the heart of these debates lies a tension within CLS itself. It seeks to expose law's ideological foundations, but in doing so, it risks undermining the very structures that many believe are necessary to pursue justice, rights, and democratic governance. The first major critique is that CLS collapses the boundaries between law and politics. CLS insists that legal reasoning is simply a form of political reasoning, undermining the special legitimacy of law. Critics such as Bigliotti of 1986 and Price in 1989 argue that this move risks reducing law to mere ideology, stripping it of unique values like procedural fairness, impartiality, and the rule of law. If law is indistinguishable from politics, what gives courts authority beyond legislatures or interest groups? This critique highlights the legitimacy problem. If law has no unique normative force, citizens may lose confidence in institutions that depend on law's authority, leading to potential instability and mistrust in governance. A second critique targets CLS's indeterminacy thesis, the claim that legal rules almost never determine outcomes. Scholars such as Lawrence in 1987 contend that this overstates the case. Many areas of law, traffic codes, property transfers, routine contracts, are straightforward, producing predictable results. By insisting on strong indeterminacy, CLS risks lapsing into epistemic relativism, where every interpretation is equally ideological, and into judicial nihilism, where judges appear unconstrained by principle. Critics fear this uh, that CLS undermines the stability of adjudication, making law seem nothing more than the whims of decision makers. While indeterminacy has power in exposing bias and ideology, critics argue that its radical form threatens law's coherence and reliability. CLS's deep skepticism toward the constitutional structures and rights discourse has also drawn criticism. By deconstructing the very foundations of constitutionalism, rights, separation of powers, objectivity, CLS risks delegitimizing the frameworks that underpin democratic governance. Critics such as Gordon in 1999 and Bigliotti in 1986 caution that abandoning faith in legal frameworks may weaken accountability mechanisms that protect rights in practice. For example, rights discourse, while imperfect, has empowered marginalized groups in civil rights struggles. To reject it wholesale, critics argue, may alienate the public and erode one of the few tools available to contest oppression. Thus, CLS is accused of destabilizing democracy while offering insufficient alternatives to secure justice and stability. These criticisms point to a central paradox in CLS. Its mission to unmask law's ideological nature conflicts with the need to preserve law's authority as a tool of justice. If law is only politics, why preserve it? Yet if law is treated as autonomous and neutral, inequality persists. This paradox animates debates in legal theory. Can we critique law without collapsing its legitimacy? CLS's refusal to reconcile this tension is both its strength and weakness. It forces scholars to grapple with law's ideological nature, but it also risks leaving reformers without viable frameworks for rebuilding or reforming legal institutions. Even with this criticism, CLS's legacy is undeniable. Its emphasis on indeterminacy, ideology, and power inspired um, many theories in legal studies and radical critiques of international law and human rights. In education, it led to alternative curricula and critical programs. While detractors accuse it of nihilism, supporters insist that CLS's value lies in its critical vigilance, exposing law's pretenses of neutrality and challenging scholars to ask hard questions about justice. Far from destroying law, CLS provides the tools for ongoing self-reflection and transformation in legal thought. In conclusion, CLS has faced sharp critiques that it undermines the legitimacy of law by collapsing law into politics, that exaggerates indeterminacy to the point of relativism, and that it endangers democratic legitimacy by destabilizing constitutional frameworks. This critiques underscores CLS's paradox. It demands radical critique while still needing the legal order as a vehicle for justice. Yet this very tension keeps CLS relevant, forcing legal scholars to confront law's entanglement with power. The enduring contribution of CLS is not a blueprint for reform, but a critical method, a reminder that law is never autonomous, never fully neutral, and always open to challenge. Through this lens, CLS continues to provoke deeper conversations about justice, power, and the future of legal thought.